Hey there, everyone. It's Jeremiah. A quick note before the show to give a plug to our Patreon account. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content like extra episodes and extended episodes. They get access to our Sticker of the Month Club, where we send out great stickers every single month. And they get access to our community Slack, where the community discusses the episodes and a lot more. If you'd like to support the podcast, if you enjoy the podcast, and you want to help us out, please consider signing up as a patron at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. That's patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Ben Ritz. Ben is the director of the Center for Funding America's Future at PPI. Also joining us today is Eric Leeper. Eric is a professor of economics at the University of Virginia, and he studies monetary and fiscal policy, and he's the recent author of a paper commissioned by PPI called Modern Monetary Theory: The End of Policy Norms as We Know Them. And that's the subject of today's episode, is modern monetary theory, what's known as MMT. Why is MMT all of a sudden in the news everywhere? Everybody on Twitter can't stop discussing this. What does MMT actually say? And what should we think about this? So, Ben and Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So let me set the stage to begin with, kind of where we are. There was some real fortuitous timing to this. In a sense, we got very lucky in that PPI had been working on this paper where, Ben and Eric had kind of been partnering on figuring out how to put out this paper about MMT for a while. And then out of nowhere, the day before it comes out, the New York Times drops this big profile, essentially, of modern monetary theory and one of its proponents, Stephanie Kelton. And I believe the original title of the thing that the New York Times wrote was like something like "Time for a Victory Lap" and declaring victory for MMT. And so naturally, economics Twitter and the social media sphere and the blogosphere and all the talking heads had a lot to say about whether MMT really deserves a victory lap. And a fun note, by the way, the New York Times has actually changed that. It no longer says victory lap. It now says, "Is this what winning looks like?" ? So there's a fun Betteridge's Law of Headlines, which is, if a headline ever asks a question, 100% of the time the answer is no. So is this what winning looks like? Is it time for a victory lap? I'll let you decide. But that's the stage of where we are. This has become a hot topic, and with incredible timing, PPI has just released this paper on what the hell MMT even is. So I guess that's where we'll start. Eric, can we get just, for people who aren't even familiar, what is the 10,000-foot overview of what is modern monetary theory?
Well, I'm going to take you from 10,000 feet to ground level because I think it may be easiest to understand by taking a specific example. And the example I want to use is the COVID relief spending. So over the course of about a year, the federal government spent something on the order of $5 trillion in various forms of COVID relief over I think there were 6 bills that were passed. And at the time, the bills were passed, the money started going out, and there was no discussion at all in the policy realm about how should we be funding this. Should we be financing it by cutting other spending? Should we be financing it by raising current or future taxes? That discussion didn't take place. So this is what I would call an unbacked fiscal expansion. That is, government spent money and didn't discuss how that spending was ultimately going to get financed. And as it happens, the way it got financed in the immediate aftermath of the bills was the federal government sold a lot more treasury bonds, and a large chunk of those bonds was bought by the Federal Reserve. So this is almost a textbook example of MMT. MMT says that the government has unlimited spending capacity because it controls the supply of money. So as long as you can print money, the argument goes, the government can always spend until you reach some sort of limit that comes from the fact that there are only finite resources available in the economy at any given time.
And this is different from traditional economics or what, people might call orthodox economics, which is very much focused on questions of how do you pay for it. There's certainly a lot of economists who are in favor of lots and lots of government spending. You can find economists who are for that and who are against it, but it's not unusual for an economist to say, let's do lots and lots of spending, or even for an economist to advocate for deficit spending because we're in a recession or something like that. But what you're saying is different about MMT is kind of the denial that you really ever have to think about how you pay for it, that just the federal government can print money, therefore it can buy whatever it wants to buy. That sounds pretty simple. Am I making it too simplistic, or is it really, that's basically it?
Well, I think that's what you see if you read various things that MMT people have written, that the act of spending creates its own financing. And what MMT is referring to is, it's not about economics, it's about accounting. It basically says that the way that the Treasury was able to write checks for COVID relief was by drawing on its account at the Federal Reserve. It doesn't have to have positive balances in that account in order to write checks. And so the Fed then creates whatever bank reserves are needed to support those checks. But we kind of all know this. This isn't anything new. And in fact, conventional economic theory says that there are times when using inflation as a source of fiscal financing is the best policy to pursue. It's just that we would never say that the only way to finance spending is by printing new currency.
Yeah, I was going to break in and say, there's a trivial level on which MMT is obviously true, in that, trivially, the federal government can print as much money as it wants, and we can pay for things that way. That part seems right. But then you have to ask the question, okay, well, what's wrong with that then? If people are turning this into, that's what we should do all the time, what's the issue?
Well, I think here you want to step back for a minute and think about what exactly is it that government spending is. So the government itself has no resources. All those resources are in the hands of the private sector. So when the government spends, it buys resources from people, cars, desks, labor hours, or it transfers resources to people through things like Social Security, Medicare, or this COVID relief that we're talking about. In both cases, the government cuts checks written on the Treasury's account at the Fed. But this is the end of MMT's analysis. So where economics comes into play is when you ask the question, how many resources can one new dollar buy? These are voluntary exchanges that are getting made. The government prints up new currency and says to people, sell us your car. Well, at what price are people willing to sell that car? And so that critical element in the mechanism is what doesn't get discussed by MMT, that there are markets out there and individuals are supplying resources and the government is buying those resources. demanding them. And the question is, at what price? And that's where, that's really, I think, the nub of the whole argument about what is missing from MMT, is they don't really want to talk about the price at which this currency can get transformed into resources.
So I'm curious, on almost a personal level, what was both of you guys' reactions to the piece that came out in the New York Times? Because this is, you guys have been working on this for quite a while. And right as you're about to send this out into the world, you get this big, essentially a puff piece, kind of blowing up MMT, puffing it up in the paper of record, the Gray Lady. When you saw that, Ben, like, what was your reaction?
My reaction was, this is going to be a long week. I think, we were trying to figure out when the right time to drop this paper was, because when we started this project, it was last year, and that was kind of before the inflation materialized. But MMT had been widely discussed, somewhat during the Democratic presidential primaries, for Bernie Sanders' plans, and people were pointing to it in the immediate aftermath of the COVID relief bills. We had printed several $1 trillion for spending for stimulus and not had any negative consequences. And so people were wondering, well, could there ever be consequences from this? And so we wanted to explain sort of why what just happened in that period wasn't a license for policymakers to go full on MMT. And so we've been working on this paper, and then as inflation arose and really had policymakers who were, let's say, MMT curious, questioning whether that was actually a good idea, it really faded into the background. And so we weren't sure what exactly the right time to drop this piece would be. And then here's the New York Times, saying that this ideology, this movement that had really been on its last legs, was actually running a victory lap. I think it took everybody by surprise and was very frustrating, but also gave us the perfect opportunity to weigh in.
Eric, I'm also curious how you approach this, because, obviously you're in the land of ideas. You're a professor, you're an academic, you're used to kind of the academic discourse, which, it can be biting in its own way, but there's normally a level of kind of gentility to it to some degree. But, you have spent, in the course of making this report, you went through dozens of MMT papers, self-styled MMT papers and descriptions of what they believe. And then right before it's about to go out, you get a New York Times puff piece that says, has the MMT experiment failed? The answer, it declares in boldface, this is a quote, is an unequivocal no. Why let someone else shape your narrative when you can shape your own? Like, when you see something like that after reading all this, like, what goes through your head?
They're not doing economics. Economists don't shape the narrative. We just do research. And we let the research speak for itself. So, when I read that piece, I thought this just makes it clear that the MMT emperor has no clothes. They have nothing at all to say about how to deal with inflation once it's in place. And so, MMT has never played by the rules that academic economists play by. It's never presented a coherent economic model that can make quantitative predictions. It relies on storytelling and metaphors in place of rigorous analysis. They say that to prevent inflation, you need to raise taxes. Well, whose taxes? How much do you need to raise them? When do you need to raise them? These are the kinds of nitty-gritty questions that macroeconomists grapple with, and they just are above it. So I wasn't really disturbed by the puff piece. I think it's a statement about the quality of journalism and what people like to read.
There's an interesting issue with reporters sometimes where rather than being able to locate the very best experts on a subject, sometimes reporters are instead locating the people who are the loudest on social media, and that appears to them to be expertise.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. But this has always been the case. I mean, Art Laffer garnered an enormous amount of attention in the late 70s and early 80s.
Laffer is an accurate name when you look at his work.
He was selling right-wing snake oil, and MMT is selling left-wing snake oil. This doesn't come as any surprise to anybody who's been paying attention for the last 40 years.
There's a point that you made right there that I'd love to zero in on, and I'd love to tell a story about my days in economics school, because my degree was in economics. I don't have a PhD, but I've dabbled. And you made the point that there's no model of how the economy works in MMT. They kind of have descriptions in English, but there's not like a formalized mathematical model, a set of equations that describe the relationship between inflation and supply and demand and output and all these things we care about. And I remember a professor telling me once that the reason that we have mathematical models is not just because we think math is awesome and, we're cool, we're smarter if we use math, but it's because they're precise. I think the thing that he said was, nobody debates what Kenneth Arrow meant when he talked about the impossibility theorem, because he described it using math. He described it using a set of equations. Meanwhile, Marxists are still debating what Karl Marx meant 200 years later, or whatever it is. Still nobody can decide, because what he wrote was just kind of this flowery, very elegant English, a German in his case, I guess. But I think he used to call this elegant English. And it really kind of strikes me as crazy that somebody would come out with a whole kind of theory about how the economy works. That's what MMT is purporting to be. But then they don't actually write any of it down in a formal model.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I think the thing to understand is that the mathematics really serves two purposes. One is one that you have alluded to, which is it forces you to be precise about what you're saying. But the second reason is that it leads you to be able to make quantitative predictions. So, if we do $5 trillion in new spending and we don't finance that by taxes, how much will inflation rise and when will it rise? That's the kind of question that we want to be able to answer. And that's really what macroeconomics has been all about for the last 50 years. And so those are the terms of debate when you want to talk about policy. And if MMT isn't willing to go along with those terms of debate, then we really have no ability to communicate with each other.
So let me play devil's advocate here for just a second, because if I'm being honest, I'm on one side of this. I think MMT is quite silly, and that probably comes through in the way I'm hosting this podcast. But to be totally fair, I'm going to try to take it from their point of view and play devil's advocate. And, one of the things that I hear out there on social media, out there in the world is, look, conventional macroeconomics has gotten a lot of these questions wrong. They got policy wrong in many different areas, especially in the Great Recession. There was, people were clamoring for austerity at all the wrong times. And what we are doing is trying to right the wrongs. And, there's no good model of how some of this works in traditional macro anyway. And so why not give something new a try? If traditional macro has gotten it so wrong for so long, there has to be a replacement. How would you respond to something like that?
Well, I think MMT is correct that the way that we think about fiscal policy, not just in the United States, but everywhere, is not terribly sensible and not very grounded in what economic theory would tell us. There are so many ways in which we could improve what fiscal policy is doing. But we have to confront the political realities of it. And, economic theory isn't being practiced by fiscal authorities around the world. And the paper talks about the fact that the German word for debt, which is Schuld, also means guilt. And that is kind of the mentality that a lot of fiscal authorities seem to follow, that it's always better to be austere than to be generous in your spending. And so that's those simple kinds of white hat, black hat labels that get put on fiscal policy don't make any economic sense. And in that way, I think what MMT is saying is correct. But to say that conventional economic theory doesn't talk about this is just factually incorrect. There's plenty of economic theory that talks about how fiscal policy could be a bigger player, a more important player in the macroeconomy. So I don't know what they're referring to when they talk about how conventional economics, or what they call orthodox economics, doesn't understand the points that they're making. We all understand the points that they're making. Alexander Hamilton understood these points, which was why he wanted to have the control of monetary policy, or of the supply of money, not in the hands of elected officials.
I think it's a good point. I think it's a good point because, beyond just the actual academic discourse that takes place in journals and formal articles, like hell, you could open the front page of the New York Times at any point in the Obama presidency and flip to the opinion section, and Paul Krugman would be in there railing for more, deficit spending. And Paul Krugman is about as mainstream as it gets, right?
Yeah, he's a little left-leaning, but he's still, in terms of his economics, pretty mainstream. Well, I have faulted Obama because when they passed the ARRA in 2009, first of all, it took a year. It was a year after the recession started that they finally passed the stimulus package. But then, in less than a week, Obama was going out and publicly saying, I will cut the deficit in half by the end of my first term. So that's sending a mixed signal. And this is actually a good illustration of what I mean by how screwy fiscal policy is. You don't go out and pass a stimulus package and then immediately say, but don't worry, I'm going to raise your taxes. You either stimulate or you don't stimulate. And so what Obama did was, and he actually followed through on that, was a very mixed message. So this unbacked fiscal expansion that that term that I used to describe COVID spending, is going to have a lot more kick than if the spending has attached to it higher future taxes. And there may be times when that's how you want to run things. But Obama, I think, was very confusing in his messaging.
After that analogy, I'm now imagining Jay Powell going out to the press and saying, we will be cutting rates this quarter, but we will be raising them right back next quarter, so don't get excited. But the next place I want to take this, because we've talked about what MMT is, what it isn't, and kind of where it falls short, and its inability to model anything formally, and thus you kind of can't pin it down. You can't actually get a lot of precise predictions, or you really can't pin them down to one meaning because there's no formal mathematical model. They can just interpret the words any way they want, depending on how it's convenient. And that leads me to where all of this came from in the first place. If all of this is happening and it's getting all this attention, I'm curious about where it started. So we've talked about the politics of austerity a little bit, in the past decade. And Ben, I guess this is a question for you. Do you think that all of this came out of the politics of austerity, or like what led to MMT being envisioned as a concept in the first place?
I want to make sure, Eric, because I'm just gonna ask Eric if you have thoughts on this that you want to jump in, just because you've been like doing a lot more historical research on MMT. So I don't want to take this from you if you've got something to add on it, but if not, I'm happy to take it.
I guess the only thing I would say about that is, first of all, from an intellectual standpoint, there isn't anything new about MMT. Okay? So I think MMT has grown out of a frustration with a lot of the kind of slow-moving phenomena in the U.S. economy, not the least of which is the increasing income inequality. And I think that they see that this is a problem that could be addressed by the federal government, potentially through various kinds of spending programs. And then they have to come up with the answer to the question, okay, how are you going to pay for this spending? And their answer is, well, we don't have to. And so it looks like there are no trade-offs. I'm not sure there's more to it than that. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's really an answer to a it's a way of getting around having to answer a question that they don't want to. It's if you can say that you're going to do all this spending and nobody is going to and you're going to get all these good things and nobody has to pay for it, that is just a lot more appealing than having to say, it's a lot easier to just pick the winners and not have to pick the losers.
Well, because it's a central part of economics that incentives matter and choices have trade-offs. Choices have opportunity cost. This is like one of the central concepts in all of economics, whether you're doing micro, macro, international, anything. There's opportunity cost. There's no free lunch. But I think you've caught something there, Ben, that MMT is essentially trying to claim that there's free lunch out there and there is no trade-off. There's no cost to doing something like this.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, up until this year, the standard MMT line was, well, we're not saying that if there's no free lunch, or we're not saying that everything's a free lunch. At a certain point, once we reach this real resource limit, once you have printed more dollars than there are things to buy, then you'll get inflation and then something has to be done. And the interesting thing is now we've gotten to that point, and it's pretty clear that they don't actually have, they're like the dog that caught the car. There is no plan for what to do with the inflation that has materialized. They're saying that, no, I think that this was a great line in the New York Times profile. Stephanie Kelton said, when asked what she'd do about inflation, she said, well, the Congressional Budget Office should have, analyzed inflation, carefully tried to project inflation impacts, and, lawmakers should have dealt with it ahead of time. Well, that's really helpful, Captain Hindsight, but, once you have the problem here, what are you going to do about it? And there's just no answer for that goes beyond, something they've been pushing more lately are things like, price controls and direct government interventions that, there's no evidence they work. We tried them in the 70s. They didn't work to curtail inflation. Then, I think it's pretty clear that there's nothing there.
Yeah, so I would like to go back to this trade-offs point because it ties in exactly with the earlier thing that I was saying, that how many resources you can acquire with newly created currency depends on prices. That's what creates the trade-offs. If prices didn't respond, there would be no trade-off. You literally could just print currency without end and acquire resources until you hit that limit that Ben was talking about. So it's this is why I think MMT really has no coherent theory of inflation. Because once you bring a coherent theory of inflation into the picture, you are confronted with the trade-offs. You realize that, oh, okay, we can do this COVID relief, but the price we pay might be 7% inflation. And I think good economics will inform policymakers of what those trade-offs are so that they can make informed choices. Bad economics tells them there are no trade-offs. And then the stuff hits the fan.
Shout out to the Bad Economics crew. Great place to discuss economics if anybody's familiar with that forum. But there's a quote from Noah Smith, prominent economist and blogger in the social media sphere, where he's essentially claimed that MMT is not economics, it's politics, that on a fundamental level, they're not doing the academic thing of we're trying to understand and accurately model the world. That what MMT is essentially a policy agenda wrapped up in the dressing of this is an economic model. But really what it is a bunch of people decided that the government should spend more money, and they kind of invented a story about why that should be so. Do you think that's a fair criticism or an accurate criticism of MMT, or is that taking it a little too far?
I think that's basically right. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to commission Eric to do this paper is, I'll be candid, I'm not an academic economist. I could not put together, the theories or the comprehensive deconstruction that Eric did. But it was important that somebody who had those tools and that background could deconstruct the theory that they were claiming to have and show, like the Wizard of Oz, we look behind the curtain and see that they're puffing it up, that there really wasn't this intellectual underpinning that they claimed to have.
I think the statement that this is really about politics and spending priorities rather than economic analysis is accurate. And a little piece of evidence of that is this semester I gave my second year PhD students a little assignment. I wrote up what I consider to be the key MMT tenets. And I said, so does this mean that the government can acquire however many resources it desires up to this limit by just creating currency? And second-year PhD students had no trouble at all seeing what the flaw in the argument is. And presumably we're dealing with PhDs when we read the MMT work. So it's hard for me to believe that the MMT advocates don't understand this basic economic point that prices convert dollars into resources. And yet it doesn't seem to appear in their work.
I think it's very interesting. One thing that also happened this weekend, right before you guys dropped this paper, was that Stephanie Kelton was out on Twitter saying, in response to critics, I've never actually said that you need to raise taxes in order to fight inflation. Because the traditional belief about MMT, when people have discussed this in past years, has always been, well, what happens if you spend a bunch of money, the government prints money, and people will think, okay, what's going to happen if you get inflation? You printed a bunch of money, there's inflation. And the traditional response, or so we believed, was, well, you'll control inflation by raising taxes. It's kind of the opposite of the traditional thing that, normally we think about controlling inflation as a monetary thing, but MMT says you'll control inflation through fiscal policy, through raising taxes. But now Stephanie Kelton came out and said, no, that's never what we actually meant. And the funny thing to me is that you kind of can't argue with her because, again, there's no formal model written down. There's just, you kind of go look at some statements she made and parse over the details of her grammar and try to interpret it like like we're going through the Talmud or something like that, and like trying to, have these debates about what exactly somebody meant. It's another consequence of not having a formal model, I think.
I was just going to read to you from page 41 of Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth.
Oh, so please do. If we've got a quote, that would be just lovely.
Myth number 2, deficits are evidence of overspending. Reality. For evidence of overspending, look to inflation. Now, I don't know how you can write that and then say the things that she's been saying.
I mean, it seems like the argument she's making is, well, to see if you were overspending, you look to inflation. That means you were overspending, but that doesn't mean you're overspending now. And it's just completely incoherent. How can she had a tweet in the last couple of days where she said, no, when I say that you use taxes to manage inflation, I mean it like a bicycle helmet. It's something that can prevent injury, but once you're already injured, it doesn't do any good. And okay, you understand that intuitively, that makes sense from an English perspective. You understand the metaphor, but without that model, there's really no clear explanation why raising taxes would stop inflation from materializing, but it's not a tool you can use to or you should use to get inflation back under control. And so it does go back to that modeling problem.
The interesting thing to me here is that, look, if this is a political project, we kind of have to analyze it through political lens, and it's so much more difficult to do what MMT is claiming to do, even if it works. Let's just even grant that the whole thing works the way they say it's going to work. Politically, it would still be impossible. Like, the Federal Reserve is so fast to act. We kind of fight recessions and we fight inflation and all these things that we don't like. We fight them mostly through the Federal Reserve as the first line of defense. And they act really, really quickly whenever things pop up. Whereas I think you pointed out, Eric, that like Obama's ARRA, the American Recovery Rescue Act, that passed more than a year after we had already been in recession. And most of the money wasn't even getting spent right away. Like, the money was like spent over time. And the federal government is just so much slower with fiscal policy, and it's so hard to get things done. Like, look at the last year with how much time it took to get the infrastructure bill and the just tortuous negotiations over Build Back Better. And then I look at someone who says, actually, that should be how we control all of economic policy, is just raise taxes. Like, that's something you can just do easily. I don't know. I mean, Ben, do you think that this is, am I crazy? Is this like not a major weakness in reality world of like a theory that claims you can do this?
So the devil's advocate answer would be that you could look to some fiscal policies like automatic stabilizers. You can have tax and spending policies that are fiscal policy that adjust automatically, and you put them in place in advance, and that doesn't require Congress to act. And so we actually had we proposed in our budget blueprint that we published a couple years ago an idea for a dynamic value-added tax that sort of would operate on this principle. So in theory, you could understand how that might work. I think in practice, number one, it's pretty clear that you're not going to get a sustained massive. They talk about programs like a federal jobs guarantee as one of the measures they would put in place as an automatic stabilizer for demand, and that just has a ton of problems, would be incredibly difficult to sustain over a period of time, and Eric talks about that in his paper. And then on top of that, just the idea that you're going to have Congress vote to do tax increases on working people at the time when their wages are being eroded by inflation, it's just not something that's politically feasible.
What a campaign message, right? I know that inflation is eating away at your wages, but don't worry, I'm going to tax you more.
And I mean, honestly, if
what
they
a
were
winner.
even though it's politically, even though it's a politically DOA, I would respect them intellectually if they were arguing for that, because at least it would be somewhat coherent with the things they've said in the past. The things they're doing now, with the goalpost moving and now resorting to price controls and these things that clearly aren't going to work, it's just ridiculous.
let me emphasize something that Ben said, because I think it's quite important. If we want to think about what can we learn from MMT, I think one thing that we could learn is to try to design these automatic stabilizers to be more effective. And I think it's probably true that our automatic stabilizers are pretty weak. I mean, if you look at the fact that unemployment compensation constantly has to get renewed, that tells you that the program isn't sufficiently responsive to the state of the economy to really function as an automatic stabilizer. And I think if we search through the budget, we could probably find any number of areas where we could improve on that automatic stabilization part, which would then take some of the politics out of the picture. Of course, you have to get it approved initially, so the politics never goes away.
Yeah, and I'll just do a quick plug and say that at the start of the pandemic, we actually published a report with 30 recommendations for dealing with this recession and the ones that came after it by strengthening automatic stabilizers. So, this isn't the idea of automatic stabilizers is a good concept. It's something that I think we do have broad agreement in the economics community on. But again, it's not something that's unique to MMT, and where MMT does try to, I'll put in air quotes, build upon it, it ends up being pretty messy and not realistic.
All right, so we're coming up on time now, and I'm going to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, which is, where can people go to learn more? And we're obviously going to link in the show notes the kind of report that Eric has put out about MMT. So if you want to actually read the report, we encourage you to do so. It'll be in the show notes. Go click it. But for Eric and Ben, what else, for people who are interested in this topic, for people who want to learn more, is there anything you would recommend for them, whether that's papers to read or, books or anything that they could use to research further?
I'm going to defer to Eric because he just spent the last 6 months doing a comprehensive literature review on this. So I'm sure if it's out there, he's come across it.
And you did just recommend another good paper on automatic stabilizers, so I think that counts.
Yeah, I guess I would tell people to look at the references in my paper. A number of these are easily digestible to a non-technical audience, and so I think that they could find things that they would understand, and and it's on both sides of the argument. It's not all. I mean, a lot of these are citations of MMT advocates, so I think that is a good place to start.
All right. Well, I'm certainly glad the paper came out and had the right timing to hopefully make an impact and counter the narrative that seems to be out there. So, Eric, Ben, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.